Okay, good afternoon. So what we need to talk about is the ancient world. Okay, because that's going to be our first section here in our course. And so let's just quickly do a timeline, okay? I know this is not a history course, but still, if you understand the history of things, it really helps to put stuff in perspective. So on our little timeline here, let's put the year 750 BC. 750 BC is a time in which most historians put Homer. I mean, it's approximate, right? And Homer was a guy who wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? And so, in other words, Homer comes around this time period, and he is writing down mythology. Okay? And what is mythology? Well, mythology is stories about the gods that are used to explain things. It's not just, a pack of lies, right? But, it's full of supernatural stuff. And so around that time, up until this time period, we can say that really mythology goes all the way back in the past. And by 750, Greece's culture, and I'm talking about Greece here, Greece's culture is complex enough that you can write things down. In other words, there's enough of a literate population. Now, I'm starting in 750 BC in Greece, but there were still many other cultures. There were the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all of whom tended to understand things through mythology. What was very different was that in 650 BC in Greece, you had what are called the First Philosophers. And these were people who are going to talk about the truths of the natural world, not in terms of mythology, but basically in terms of what we would call science. So these are people who are interested in using human observation and reason in order to try to understand the world. So philosophy, this is the symbol for philosophy, by the way. Philosophy really is created at a time in which people begin to turn their backs on mythology. So instead of understanding things through the gods, they want to understand things rationally. So that's around 650 BC. Okay, and this is a huge change right here. And this is really where the Western world begins to come in, because it's the Greeks who are the first ones to turn their minds toward, again, what we would call science. Okay, so that's around 650. Now, just to sort of understand the political history of the period, here's sort of the shtick. Imagine, if you will, or take, if you will, this. So all cultures kind of start out, from an inception point, and they tend to grow to a certain height. And then when they get to that height, there generally is something in which they implode and fall apart. If you're familiar with this in sociology, perhaps you may have talked about the demographic transition. That's what we're talking about. And so what happens in the ancient world, for our purposes, we are going to start with the Greeks. Again, the ancient world is much larger than just the Greeks. But because we're doing this in a philosophical standpoint, we're just going to look at the Greeks. So the Greek culture did exactly this. Starts out very small Greek city-states and whatnot, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And it gets to a point here wherein it pretty much occupies most of the known world at the time, which, for us, the known world is largely the Mediterranean. But when Greece becomes a huge, international empire, so to speak, very quickly, it kind of implodes, and you have wars between Greek city-states themselves, almost akin to a civil war, and they are essentially taken over by the Macedonians. All the while, the Romans, who were very small and powerless and not very significant when the Greeks were at their power, slowly also go through the process of becoming slowly more powerful and acquiring more lands until they too become a huge empire. And when they reach a certain height, guess what? They fall into all kinds of civil war and chaos and ultimately destroy themselves. And in 476 AD, Rome ceases to be a city of its own. It is occupied by the Germans, and that pretty much is the end of the ancient world. So between 750 BC and 476 AD is where our course is going to situate itself in the ancient world. Now, real quick, in terms of geography, this is sort of the deal. So here, let me just draw a really cheesy map of Europe, okay? Just bear with me here, okay? Okay, it's pretty bad, but you get the point here, right? Yeah, that's pretty bad. Okay, well, Italy, Greece, Scandinavia, France and Spain, sort of, okay. So here's the deal. Here's Greece. So Greece sort of expands into this area here in the height of its power. And in 160, I think it was 161 or 160 BC, what happens is Rome, which had been slowly sort of taking over Greece's power, turns Greece into a province. So by 161 BC, Greece now becomes a province of Rome. Now here's the thing. The Romans spoke Latin. And the Greeks obviously spoke Greek, right? But in the ancient period, what the deal was, the Greeks came first, and they were an older, more established, more refined, more advanced culture. And when the Romans took over, they learned Greek. And they learned a lot of Greek philosophy. They learned a lot of Greek culture, to make a long story short. And so the ancient world is really often called Greco-Roman, because the Greeks sort of, and this is oversimplifying, I understand, but the Greeks sort of made or invented Western culture. Then the Romans adopted much of that culture but changed it into their own language. So the ancient world, we're going to say, is largely Greco-Roman. So a lot of the philosophy that we're going to talk about was transferred from Greece to Rome, and a lot of it translated into Latin and all that kind of stuff. But the thing to keep in mind is that while philosophy was flourishing in the ancient period, in 476 AD, the Germans came down, occupied Rome, and ended what we call the ancient world.